How's it going? My name is William Taylor. Um, I've been a New Testament student for the last 30 years of my life. I've studied everything from theology, different branches of Christianity. I've studied the history of Christianity and how Christianity was formed. Um, and I've gone really deep, uh, even as far as textual criticism and source criticism. Um, but I hear lately that there's a lot of people who, like a lot of New Testament scholars who claim that the Gospels are post 70 AD. Um, for example, Matthew is placed post 70 for many reasons. There's instances, I believe, in Matthew 15, somewhere in Matthew 15, if I remember correctly, where Jesus mentions that the city, he gave a parable. He spoke about a king, and this king basically burned the city down. And also, you have Matthew 24, where it speaks about the temple being destroyed. Um, so, because a lot of people who are New Testament scholars and are also, um, I will say, atheists or have an atheistic mentality. Well, they don't believe in prophecy. However, I think there's plenty of biblical proof um, to demonstrate that Jesus, if he existed, or he's just simply an amalgamation of ideas from the Old Testament, written by somebody, of course, right? Then these ideas have to come from somewhere, and I can easily demonstrate that the people writing the New Testament, in this case Matthew, um, did not need actual history for him to come up with some of the ideas contained within the his gospel. For example, the city being burnt, the city being destroyed, and the temple being destroyed. These are all ideas already found in the Old Testament. Um, for example, in the book of Daniel, I mean, not coincidentally, but I would say fortunate enough, whoever wrote the Gospel of Matthew in the chapter 24, it speaks about, um, whoever reads the book of Daniel, let him understand. So, in the fact that that chapter is speaking about the destruction of the temple, that's a good reference as to where the idea of the temple being destroyed would have come from. I know that a lot of people say, well, the whole generation thing, I mean, nobody could have predicted that, but that's actually wrong because we also have documents that demonstrates that the Essenes, the people who were at the Qumran caves, were already anticipating a major event surrounding the destruction of the temple, and their writings predate the year 70. So I think that the idea and the possibility of the temple being destroyed was already in the air, and that's mainly because of the 70 weeks of Daniel, and everybody was already interpreting that as being within their lifetime, within the time frame of those 70 weeks, which is comprised of 490 years. So I think that when these experts claim that the New Testament, or in this particular case, the book of Matthew, is post 70, I think is really a weak argument because of all the other documents that we have from the Old Testament, which would have given rise to the idea that this event indeed was going to happen within their lifetime, within the lifetimes of those writing the, in this case, the book of Matthew and the book of Luke. I strongly believe, because of the evidence, that the book of Matthew was written before the year 49. And the reason for that idea stems from the fact that when you read the letter to the Thessalonians, which is a undisputed letter of Paul, we see that a lot of his language reflects Matthew. But then somebody will argue, well, if the Gospels were already in circulation, even as early as that, why couldn't that be Mark, the one that he's actually making allusions to or reference to? And the reason being is because I believe in Thessalonians 5, I think it starts in Thessalonians 4 and then it moves towards First Thessalonians chapter 5. Paul speaks about not quenching the spirit, staying away from drunkardness, and some other themes that, when you look at these themes, contrary to what some experts believe, that Paul was actually referencing Joel. The reason why he's not referencing Joel is because when I looked in the original Hebrew and in the Septuagint, a lot of the keywords and keyword phrases that Paul is using, and you analyze in the order in which these keywords are flowing between these two chapters, they seem to match the same flow of order as in Matthew chapter 24, somewhere towards the end of the chapter, and beginning in chapter 25, where it talks about events that were going to happen and things relating to the second coming. Then in Matthew 24, towards the end, and then beginning in Matthew 25, he talks about drunkardness, and more importantly, Jesus did refer to the not quenching the spirit, because when he gives the parable of the 10 virgins, he speaks of sleeping. In Matthew, and a few verses before, he speaks about drunkenness, and then the lamps represents people, and the oil represents the Holy Spirit, and the lamps burning represents the fire of the Holy Spirit. So when you analyze the order of all these themes and the keyword phrases, and you compare them to Matthew, now what you're realizing at that moment is that Paul indeed was referencing Matthew, and he must have had by then a written form of the Greek gospel of Matthew. Because when he says do not quench the spirit, he talks about don't be found in drunkenness. And this is Paul, right? Obviously, quenching the spirit is not an exact word for keep your lamps burning and the whole concept of the virgins. But when you look at the theme and you extract keywords that are interrelated, for example, olive oil or having oil in your lamp is symbolic of you being full of the Holy Spirit. Your lamps burning is equivalent to you saying do not quench the Holy Spirit. So when you find these parallels and you match the order of sequence of keywords, you find that Thessalonians is making an allusion to a tradition only found in Matthew. And that is the tradition and all the keyword order of the concept of falling asleep, the quenching of the spirit, not being found in drunkenness, and these keywords match in the same order as in Thessalonians. So if Thessalonians is evidence, and that's only one brief example, I have other examples to prove that Paul was alluding to Matthew in many instances. Because what I did in my study, I looked at the texts, and in these texts, I try to look for parallels when it comes to keyword order, keyword phrases, and looked at them in the Septuagint for the Old Testament, and I also looked at the Greek New Testament, and I was looking for any sort of similarities or patterns. What I did notice is that not only Thessalonians make strong allusions to Matthew, um, what really is interesting is a lot of the themes found in Thessalonians you don't really find in any other gospel than in Matthew. Now we also have a tradition by Papias and others. I think Irenaeus or and Eusebius mentioned that the Gospels. Well, I mean, Papias doesn't make it clear. It seems like Matthew, according to Papias, was first. Whether Mark came after is not really clear. And then Luke and John. However, I think it's Irenaeus who mentions that the Gospels without a without what is it called, a genealogies came first, and those without genealogies came after. And to me, whether Mark is before Matthew, between Matthew and Luke, or after Matthew and Luke, it has no bearing because of the strong allusions that Thessalonians is making to Matthew. It already places Matthew as early as 48, because Thessalonians was written by the year 49. And then you also got to give the time that it takes for a person to deliver the letter. So I think that it's fair to say that at the very least Matthew has to be way before 48. I can place it as early as 45, only because of the time that it would have taken Paul to read and reread this gospel, so that at a subconscious level, he could expound the ideas that he did in Thessalonians, and so that through a fuzzy memory, he's sort of like bringing all these ideas in a very malleable way, because he's relying on memory, and every now and then some of the keywords or keyword concepts or themes pop up. We do that all the time. I mean, when we kind of like reference some sort of document that we've read and reread, we paraphrase it, and we're not exact with every single quotation, but every now and then a keyword or a keyword phrase that is in the source content will pop up in our reference. But you also got to bear in mind that Paul was a Jew, and he had the Jewish scriptures since he was a child, since early youth. So he had more time to commit to memory a lot of the concepts of the Old Testament, whereas the New Testament is something that to him at that time was still relatively new. It came to his life at an adulthood lifetime, at a point where he was already an adult, where memory may not work as sharp as when somebody's young. So this is why a lot of the allusions to the Old Testament are more exact and sharper than those allusions to the New Testament. But also, in my study, what I found is I try to look for every time Paul made an allusion to the Old Testament without using the keyword phrase in the scriptures. So anytime Paul makes an allusion to something and he doesn't tell you where the reference came from, and you see that allusion comes from the Old Testament, but then he inserts his own idea, I made a notation of that every time that happened. All the other instances in which he says in the scriptures, I excluded those because it would be too obvious. It would be too easy for us to conclude that, yeah, he's actually quoting the scriptures. But whenever he does it without quoting where it came from, without mentioning where it came from, will show us that this is actually Paul's writing style, where he will quote something, you don't know where he's quoting it from, and then he will insert his own ideas. The more he does this, then our confidence level goes up that indeed this is the writing style and the thought process of whoever's writing these seven accepted letters. So why am I saying that? Because then whenever there are allusions to the New Testament, and these allusions have Paul's own ideas, even though a portion of that allusion seems to come from the New Testament, then it should not surprise us that he indeed had the gospel, but he's doing the same thing he's doing with references from the Old Testament. I'll give you an example. Paul mentioned one time that he says we have to have the armor of faith, the shield of something, and you say, well, that's probably Paul's own writing, but he never says where he got that idea from. That actually comes from Isaiah. I believe it's Isaiah 40 something or 50. No, I think it's Isaiah 38, where Isaiah says that we have to have the armor of faith and all of that. The only thing is that Paul used sort of the same concept, but he gave it a little twist and inserted his own ideas. And throughout Paul's letter, he does that quite a lot for the Old Testament without mentioning where he's getting the reference from. Now, when we move towards references to the New Testament, he does the same thing, adding his own little twist, but you can see that the reference alludes to something found in the gospel, but in this case, most of the time is the Gospel of Matthew. So, if Thessalonians was written in the year 49, Paul is making allusions to it, then you also gotta give the time that Matthew wouldn't need to get Matthew into the complex structure that it is. And then the time that Paul would have need to actually absorb the information, commit it to memory, so that he's able to expound it in a way where doing the same thing, using the same methodology as he does whenever he references the Old Testament or alludes to the Old Testament, then that kind of tells you that the Gospel of Matthew needs to be a little bit further than 49 or 48, AD 48. It has to be somewhere. I mean, I will agree with what some of the early church fathers said, that Matthew was written 7 years after the death of Jesus, which will place it around the year 39. Let's say 40. And that makes sense, because if the year 40 and somewhere around that era, somewhere around that time, Paul was going through all the events that he was going through. He went to Arabia, which I don't think Arabia actually means the country Arabia. I think it's Araba. Araba could really mean a cut in the stone, and it is known that there's a place in Damascus that was known as Araba, where the disciples met. So I think that when Paul went there for 3 years, I think that I don't know how soon after Jesus' death Paul converted, but I will have to say that it needs to be before 39, because by the year 38, there was an issue with Pontius Pilate and Caiaphas, who was the high priest at that time. And it seems like the governor from Damascus, not Damascus. I think the governor from some part, right? He had the ruling over all that section. It's a little north of Israel. He took out, he took Pontius Pilate from his office, and so did and also Caiaphas were taken out. So why is this important to know? Because right around that time, that's when Paul converted to Christianity, which I I find very coincidental that this man is converting when the powers under which he's working under are losing their office. Anyway, I didn't want to segue like that in this video. So that means that Paul is converting somewhere around 37, 38. Then he goes to Arabia for 3 years. No, he was in Damascus for 3 years. And then I think he went to Arabia for... Anyhow, there's a huge gap for Paul. I mean, he started preaching immediately after he converted, but I don't think he took the gospel too far away from Israel, not only 15 years afterwards, which places him, that 15-year time frame, it's where First Thessalonians finally comes into the scene after that 15-year time span, which is coincidental when you look at the external data, because then that's right around the time in which the Gospel of Matthew, it is said to have been written. So when you analyze First Thessalonians, you can see that it makes strong allusions to Matthew. But then something happened to Paul around the year 52. A procurator asked him, are you that Egyptian? Are you that Egyptian who took 4,000 men into the desert? And I think it's very important to understand that historical event, it's all the motivation Christians needed for them to change the flight to Egypt birth narrative. Why? Because when you look at all these internal and external data, you can see that Paul is making allusions to Matthew at a point in which the whole Egyptian rebel would have not been a problem. The Egyptian rebel became a problem. He was some sort of messianic pretender after the year 52. And then Paul and the movement, Christianity or whatever it was called during that early time, the least thing that they actually wanted is to be misidentified with this Egyptian false prophet. This is why when you look at 1 Corinthians, which is 55 AD, and you have 1 Thessalonians, which is 49 AD, you can see a number of things, which is, the letters are a timeline. They make allusions to, like in the case of 1 Thessalonians, it makes allusions to Matthew. You have the event of the Egyptian false prophet in the year 52. Now in the year 55, 1 Thessalonians is making allusions to both Matthew and Luke. So I think Luke really did know Matthew. But you got to remember that when you analyze the writing style of Luke, Luke is really interested in making all his main characters be under a good light. How do we see this? Is the first example I can give you is when Peter steps out of he doesn't step out of the boat. It doesn't sink. When in Matthew he does, showing Peter, which is a leader of the church, as a weak person in faith. And that would have not been something that Luke would want in his gospel. Second thing is, when Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan," that's something that's also omitted in the Gospel of Luke. So what is that shows us is that Luke's writing style is that he will never do anything that will put his main characters in a bad light. And then when he does that, he actually does the opposite to show the opposite let me see how can I elaborate this. Um, Luke didn't want to make Peter seem bad, right? Seem as a weak person, and he makes him look as a very strong leader of the church. Um, so there are reasons why he does this, and then when you look at the fact that in the book of Acts, I think it's in chapter 18 or 19, the Egyptian false prophet is mentioned. A rebel who went to the Mount of Olives. So that means that it would have been in the good interest of Luke to omit the whole flight to Egypt, even though he has Matthew in front of him, because a lot of what is contained in Luke seems to be coming more from Matthew than it is from Mark. I mean, when you analyze, I've done it. I mean, when you analyze the Koine Greek, I believe there's only 15% of Mark in Luke, and about 30% of Matthew is in Luke, something like that, or I think it's 60%. It's 60% of Matthew, and then Matthew, and then Luke has the other remaining percentage, original content. This is why a lot of people say that Luke has its own source, which they call L, parallel with the Q. I don't believe in Q. I don't believe in L, because when you place my hypothesis in a timeline and then you use the letter of Thessalonians to mark a date because of the allusions made to Matthew, and you can place Matthew a little bit before or at the same date, not post, but it needs to be before it. And then you have the event of the Egyptian false prophet in the year 52. Now you see Luke reintroducing a new gospel. And how do we know Luke is introducing a new gospel? By the year 55, because of the references found in Corinthians. Corinthians makes strong allusions to Luke, and it actually quotes Luke directly, but it also quotes indirectly Matthew. And how do I know it's quoting Matthew and Luke? Again, it has to do with the keyword order and how they flow in the same order. So I don't think it is coincidence for us to find that you have the Gospel of Matthew, Gospel of Luke. You have early church fathers saying that Matthew was written in the year 39, Luke was written after, and then those Gospels without genealogies were written afterwards. I think the internal data of the letters in comparison to the Gospels, and looking at how many times this pattern emerges, it raises the confidence level that all these scholars have it all wrong. Matthew is not post 70. And then somebody said to me when I told them about this, they say, well, you know what? It could have been that somebody had the letters and then they wrote the Gospels. There's a big problem with that. Because when you look at the data, let's begin with references and allusions to the Old Testament. When you see that the letters of Paul are making allusions to the Old Testament without saying in the scriptures, and then you see that these keywords flow in the same order, then that raises our confidence level that if he's making allusions to the New Testament, this is indeed his style. It doesn't mean that somebody had the letter and then they wrote the Gospels, because then that will be super problematic, because that will be like saying that a forger was so damn intelligent to the point that he cataloged every keyword, and as he's writing a false gospel using the letters of Paul, he would have to always keep in mind where the keywords are coming from, so that he can create this false chronology that matches the letters, because he anticipated that people in the future would have seen this pattern, and it would have helped validate in a false way that the Gospels chronology are actually early. Like, really think about that, what I just said. So you're saying a forger had the ability to foresee that people were going to see this pattern, and using the pattern, we're going to help date the Gospels as early as these letters, when I have never heard anybody say or mention what I just told you, using statistical analysis and keyword placement and keyword order. For all I know, I might be the first person in the world who has discovered this, because I believe you me, I have never read it in any article or book. I'm in the process of writing a few papers and coming up with a better video, more professional, with a whiteboard, so that I can illustrate everything and help make sense of it. So if I'm the first one who discovered this, to my knowledge, and ancient people didn't see this pattern, then it's very unlikely a forger would have been so intelligent to catalog all these keywords and make sure that the keywords match each gospel in the same order in which they're referencing from each letter. I think it's so difficult for me to visualize something like that as being possible. For one, the time that it takes to write a letter and send it, distribute it, then the time that it takes to make copies and distribute it to other churches. These people didn't have a fast way of communication. I mean, I think the only way something like that could work is if you have all the letters of Paul by the year 150 CE, and you will have to have then catalog each keyword in each letter, and the Gospels do not exist at that time, and then you will have to also have known all the papias and all the early church fathers traditions as to when the Gospels were written, so that then you can emulate the flow of these references in that are seen in the letters, matching how each gospel will reflect that. What I mean by that is that if you're gonna forge Matthew, then you will want to do so only using the letter of Thessalonians and keeping all the keyword phrases from any other letter. Then when you come to forge Luke, now you got to say, well, now we got to forge it using Corinthians, so that it can reflect that he's actually alluding to Luke. I mean, I just presented you a scenario that not only it sounds convoluted, but super ridiculous. And I don't think nobody would have had that level of intelligence to foresee that. Again, I know this is very crude video that I just did. Given the time that I have, I don't have a lot of time. I'm gonna see if very soon I'm gonna come up with a video, have a whiteboard, extract the Koine Greek from the letters, comparing to the Gospels and all that, and you're gonna see a pattern emerge, and then we're gonna use a timeline of actual history, and then you're gonna see that using the argument of inference to the best explanation, the events of the year 52 with that Egyptian false prophet beautifully explains why Luke seems to be referencing 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians is AD 55, but Luke does not make any mention of the flight to Egypt. It's because of the events of the year 52 that would have put Christians in a negative light and made the Jesus character be under a negative light, as though he's possibly this rebel who probably survived crucifixion because he was in Egypt. He's not Egyptian, but he was in Egypt. And this false prophet that is running around in the year 52 AD, claiming to be something, claiming to be the Messiah, which, by the way, he said that he's going to be in the Mount of Olives, and then the walls are going to collapse. That just is something that level of attention. I don't think Christians will want to attract that level of attention by having a book saying, yeah, our leader, who happens to have the same name of the man who knocked down the walls, which is Joshua, is also from Egypt. Like, it would not work, man. Especially if they want to spread the gospel around, Rome and up in Antioch. That would have been a big problem, because imagine if a procurator knew about this Egyptian rebel, and when Paul was preaching Jesus, he immediately said, "Oh, are you that Egyptian false prophet?" So there was a misassociation because of a combination of Paul's preaching and the current events of that Egyptian false prophet. So what do you think is going to happen afterwards? Paul himself said it, "I will do anything not to hinder the message of the gospel." And the whole flight to Egypt found in Matthew would have been a big hindrance. Therefore, Luke is a direct revision of Matthew. There's a lot of internal evidence for that. There's external evidence, and the final piece of evidence is using the argument of inference to the best explanation. I hope that answers some of the questions. I know it was kind of extensive. It's just I have a little bit of an accent, and it's sometimes hard for me to express certain ideas. I mean, I speak 4 languages, so it's like they said, a jack of all trades, a master of none. So it's hard for me to convey some ideas. So I hope this gives you a little bit of what you will need if you know how to speak and read and write Koine Greek, to start doing your own research, and hopefully this helps.